My neighbor cut off my power, so I took over his entire meter. You come home from work to find your house completely dark. No power, no explanation. Just a smug neighbor standing in his yard, arms crossed, watching you fumble with your phone's flashlight. That's when you notice the fresh dirt around your electrical meter and the new padlock that wasn't there this morning. Your neighbor Jim thinks he's won this war over property lines. What he doesn't know is that he just declared war on the wrong person. Someone who actually owns the electrical easement he's been using for 20 years. Meet Sarah Chen, a 34-year-old electrical engineer who thought she'd found her forever home on Maple Street. The 1950s ranch house came with mature oak trees, a spacious backyard, and what seemed like friendly neighbors. Sarah had been living peacefully for 3 years, quietly upgrading her home's electrical systems and enjoying her weekend garden projects. Her neighbor Jim Morrison, not the rock star, just a retired insurance adjuster with way too much time on his hands, lived in the identical house next door. For the first 2 years, they'd exchanged pleasant waves and borrowed the occasional cup of sugar. Jim seemed harmless enough, always tinkering in his garage or obsessing over his pristine lawn. The trouble started when Sarah decided to install a home charging station for her new electric vehicle. She'd done all the research, pulled the proper permits, and hired licensed electricians. Everything was completely legal and up to code. But Jim had other ideas about what belonged in his neighborhood. The property line between their homes ran straight down the middle, clearly marked by the original survey stakes Sarah had found in her closing documents. But there was something interesting about the electrical setup that most homeowners never think to check. Both houses had been built when the neighborhood was developed, and the electrical meters sat on what appeared to be a shared utility easement. Sarah knew from her engineering background that utility easements could be tricky legal territory. Most homeowners assume the utility company owns the land where meters sit, but that's not always the case. Sometimes, especially in older developments, one property owner actually holds the easement rights while allowing neighbors to share access. Jim had been paying his electric bill to the same meter location for decades, never questioning who actually owned the small strip of land where both meters sat. He'd even built a small decorative fence around his meter, planted flowers nearby, and considered it part of his property maintenance routine. What Jim didn't realize was that Sarah was the type of person who reads every single document in a property purchase. She'd noticed an unusual clause in her deed about electrical easement rights, but hadn't thought much about it at the time. The language was dense and legal, referring to exclusive easement privileges and utility access coordination responsibilities. As Sarah stood in her dark house that evening, she remembered exactly where she'd filed those property documents. Jim's little power play was about to backfire in ways he never saw coming. Sometimes the quiet neighbor who minds their own business is exactly the wrong person to mess with. But first, she needed to understand how this war had started. And it all began with a simple car charger that Jim decided threatened his entire way of life. It started with a polite knock on Sarah's door on a Saturday morning. Jim stood on her porch holding a printed email, his face wearing that fake friendly expression people use when they're about to deliver bad news. "Hey there, Sarah. Got a minute? I think there might be a little issue with your new car charger project." Sarah invited him in for coffee, genuinely thinking this would be a neighborly conversation about scheduling or noise concerns during installation. She was wrong. Jim spread the email across her kitchen table like he was presenting evidence in court. It was from the Maple Street Homeowners Association, an organization Sarah didn't even know existed. The subject line read, "Violation Notice, Unauthorized Electrical Modifications." Apparently, Jim said, stirring his coffee slowly, the HOA has strict rules about major electrical work. You're supposed to get approval before installing anything that might affect the neighborhood's electrical grid stability. Sarah read through the notice, her engineering mind immediately spotting the problems. The HOA was claiming her legal, permitted car charger somehow violated community electrical standards and aesthetic guidelines. They were demanding she remove the charging station within 30 days or face escalating fines starting at $500. Jim, I pulled all the proper permits through the city. This installation is completely legal and up to code. I've never even heard of this HOA. Jim's friendly mask started slipping. Well, maybe you should have done your research before moving into an established community. We've all been living here peacefully for years without people making unilateral decisions that affect everyone. Affect everyone how? Exactly. It's a charging port on my own house, connected to my electrical panel. The electrical draw, Sarah. You're pulling extra power that could overload the neighborhood circuits. Plus, it's an eyesore. Property values, you know? Sarah looked out her window at Jim's yard, where 3 rusty cars sat permanently parked on blocks, and an above-ground pool dominated his backyard like a giant blue tumor. She decided to keep that observation to herself. I'll look into this HOA situation, but Jim, my electrician, confirmed the neighborhood grid can easily handle the additional load. Modern car chargers are actually pretty efficient. Jim stood up, his coffee barely touched. Look, I'm just trying to help you avoid bigger problems down the road. The HOA president, Karen Walsh, she doesn't mess around. I've seen her fine people into selling their houses over smaller violations than this. After Jim left, Sarah spent the afternoon researching. What she found was disturbing. The Maple Street HOA was a 3-person board consisting of Jim Morrison, Karen Walsh, and Karen's husband Rick. They'd apparently formed the association 5 years ago without notifying most residents, and had been selectively enforcing made-up rules ever since. The deeper Sarah dug, the angrier she got. This wasn't about electrical safety or property values. This was about control. Jim had decided her car charger made his vintage car collection look bad, so he'd weaponized a fake HOA to force her compliance. She found online forums where other neighborhoods complained about similar fake HOA scams. Neighbors who formed unofficial associations created official-looking documents and collected fines for violations that didn't actually exist. The victims usually paid up rather than fight, assuming the harassment was legitimate, but Jim had picked the wrong target for his power games. Sarah wasn't the type to be intimidated by fake authority figures or fraudulent paperwork. She was an engineer who solved problems systematically, and Jim Morrison had just become a problem that needed solving. What Jim didn't know was that Sarah's quiet demeanor hid someone who'd spent years dealing with corporate bullies and bureaucratic nonsense. She'd learned long ago that the best way to handle people who abuse fake authority is to find their real weakness and exploit it completely. The war was just beginning, and Jim had no idea what he'd started. The fines started arriving every week like clockwork. First, $500 for failure to comply with electrical modification removal notice. Then, $750 for continued violation of community standards. By the 4th week, Karen Walsh was demanding $1,500 and threatening legal action. Sarah tried reasoning with them first. She attended the HOA's monthly meeting, held conveniently in Karen's living room with no advance notice to other residents, armed with her permits, electrical codes, and engineering certifications. She might as well have been speaking to a brick wall. Miss Chen, Karen announced from behind her dining room table like she was a federal judge, "Your credentials don't override our community authority." This association was formed to protect property values and neighborhood character. Your industrial charging equipment violates both. It's a standard level to charger, Karen. They're in millions of homes across America. Jim leaned forward, his arms crossed. Maybe in California or New York, but this is a traditional neighborhood with traditional values. We don't want to become some kind of experimental green energy testing ground. Rick Walsh, Karen's husband and the HOAS treasurer, slid a new document across the table. This is a formal cease and desist order. Remove the charging station by Friday or we'll be forced to take additional enforcement actions. What kind of enforcement actions? Karen smiled the way a cat smiles at a cornered mouse. We have several options available to us. Liens against your property, legal injunctions, emergency interventions to protect community infrastructure. Sarah left that meeting knowing these people weren't going to stop. This wasn't about rules or community standards. This was about three neighbors who'd tasted a little power and decided to abuse it. The harassment escalated quickly after that. Jim started documenting everything Sarah did with his phone camera. Taking out trash, checking her mail, working in her garden. He was always there, recording, building some kind of case file like she was a criminal under surveillance. Karen began sending certified letters every few days, each one more threatening than the last. She claimed Sarah's car charger was causing power fluctuations that were damaging other residents' electronics. She alleged the installation had violated historical preservation guidelines, despite the neighborhood having zero historical significance. She even tried to claim the charger's lead status light constituted light pollution. Then things got weird. Sarah started finding official-looking notices taped to her front door claiming she was violating noise ordinances, parking regulations, and landscaping standards that didn't exist. Jim had apparently printed fake city documents using official-looking letterhead he'd found online. The breaking point came when Sarah discovered they were actively sabotaging her property. Her garden sprinklers had been redirected to spray Jim's driveway instead of her flower beds. Someone had loosened her mailbox post so it tilted at an awkward angle. Most seriously, she caught Jim measuring the exact distance from her property line to her electrical meter with a contractor's tape measure. "What are you doing, Jim?" He didn't even look embarrassed. "Just making sure everything's properly positioned according to utility easement requirements. Wouldn't want any code violations." That's when Sarah realized what was coming next. Jim had been researching electrical easements, probably planning to claim her meter was improperly positioned or somehow violating utility access requirements. He was looking for any technical excuse to escalate this conflict beyond fines and harassment letters. The final straw came 3 weeks later when Sarah returned home to find her power completely shut off. No warning, no explanation. Just darkness and Jim standing in his yard with that smug expression, watching her discover the new padlock on her electrical meter. Sarah decided it was time to do some research of her own. That evening, she pulled out her property deed, surveyor's notes, and the original neighborhood development plans she'd requested from the county records office. What she found in those documents made her smile for the first time in weeks. Jim thought he was playing checkers, but Sarah was about to introduce him to chess. He'd been so focused on attacking her car charger that he'd never bothered to verify who actually controlled the electrical infrastructure he was threatening to weaponize against her. Sometimes the best defense is discovering you've been holding the nuclear option the entire time. Sarah spread the documents across her dining room table like a general planning a counterattack. 26 years of property records, original development blueprints, and utility easement agreements told a story that Jim Morrison had never bothered to investigate. The smoking gun was buried in subsection 12 of her property deed. Grantor hereby conveys exclusive easement rights for electrical utility coordination and access management for properties 1247 and 1249 Maple Street, including but not limited to meter placement, utility access, and infrastructure modification authority. In plain English, Sarah didn't just own her property, she owned the electrical easement rights for both houses. Jim had been paying his electric bill for 20 years on land that Sarah legally controlled, but it got better. The original development plans showed that both electrical meters sat entirely on Sarah's property, not on a shared utility easement as it appeared. The surveyor's notes were crystal clear. The electrical infrastructure for both homes had been deliberately placed on Lot 1247. Sarah's lot, with easement rights granted to Lot 1249 for access only. The utility company had been billing Jim directly for decades. But they'd been doing it as a courtesy arrangement, not a legal right. Sarah's deed gave her the authority to coordinate electrical utility access for both properties, which meant she could legally control how and when that access was provided. Sarah called her lawyer friend Monica, who specialized in property law. After reviewing the documents, Monica was practically laughing. "Sarah, do you understand what you're holding here? You don't just have legal control over his electrical access. You have the right to modify, relocate, or restrict it entirely. Jim's been threatening to cut off your power, but legally, you're the one with the authority to cut off his. That seems too good to be true. It's unusual, but it's completely legitimate." These kinds of easement arrangements were common in 1950s developments where builders wanted to minimize infrastructure costs. They'd put all the electrical equipment on one lot and grant access rights to the adjacent lot. The problem is most people never read their deeds carefully enough to understand what they own. Monica paused, and Sarah could hear papers rustling on the other end of the phone. Here's the really interesting part. If Jim has been making any modifications to the electrical setup, like that decorative fence around his meter or any landscaping changes, he technically needed your permission as the easement holder. Sarah looked out her window at Jim's elaborate gardens set up around his electrical meter. Decorative stones, planted flowers, a small wooden border fence, and a motion sensor security light he'd installed last year. All of it was technically on her easement, installed without her permission. "Monica, what if he's actually cut off my power? Can I legally restore it myself?" "Not only can you restore it, Sarah, but you can restructure the entire electrical arrangement however you see fit, as long as you follow proper utility company procedures. Jim cutting off your power without permission is actually illegal tampering with your easement rights." Sarah felt a slow smile spreading across her face. Jim had just handed her the perfect legal justification for everything she was about to do. He'd been so busy trying to control her property that he'd never realized she already controlled his. The next morning, Sarah made phone calls that would change everything. The first was to the utility company to report unauthorized tampering with her electrical easement. The second was to her original electrical contractor to schedule some very interesting modifications to the neighborhoods. PowerGrid. Jim Morrison was about to learn the difference between fake authority and real legal power, and Sarah was going to enjoy every single minute of teaching him that lesson. Sarah's plan was elegant in its simplicity. If Jim wanted to play games with electrical access, she'd show him what real authority looked like. First, she called the utility company's legal department and explained the situation. After reviewing her deed and the original easement agreements, they confirmed what Monica had told her. Sarah had the legal right to manage electrical access for both properties. More importantly, any modifications to the electrical setup required her written approval as the easement holder. "Mom, we've been billing Mr. Morrison directly as a courtesy, but you're correct that the legal arrangement gives you coordination authority. If you want to make changes to the electrical access arrangement, we'll need to work through you. What if I wanted to consolidate both meters under my direct management? Route his electrical service through my account." There was a pause while the representative consulted with supervisors. "That would be unusual, but it's within your rights as the easement holder. We'd need proper documentation, and Mr. Morrison would need to be notified of the billing arrangement change." Perfect. Sarah's second call was to her original electrical contractor. "Remember that car charger installation Jim complained about? I need you to come back and make some additional modifications to the electrical setup. Completely legal, but I want everything documented properly." The contractor arrived the next morning with a work crew and proper permits. Sarah had decided to exercise her easement rights in the most visible way possible. If Jim wanted to control her electrical modifications, she'd control his entire electrical access. The crew began by installing a master electrical management system that would route both properties' power through Sarah's main panel. It was perfectly legal since she owned the easement, and it was actually more efficient from an engineering standpoint. Both houses would still receive full electrical service, but it would all flow through equipment that Sarah directly controlled. Jim noticed the work crew around 9 in the morning and came storming over, his face already red with anger. "What the hell do you think you're doing on my property?" Sarah's contractor looked up from the electrical panel installation. "Actually, sir, we're working on Miss Chen's electrical easement. She's the legal easement holder for this entire area. That's impossible. I've been paying my own electric bill for 20 years. Sarah walked over, carrying a folder full of legal documents. "Jim, meet me at your mailbox. I think we need to have a conversation." She spread the property deed and easement agreements across the hood of Jim's car, pointing to the relevant sections. "See this? I own the electrical easement rights for both properties. That includes your meter, the land it sits on, and the authority to modify electrical access arrangements." Jim's confidence started cracking as he read through the documents. "This can't be legal. You can't just take over someone else's electrical service." "I'm not taking it over, Jim. I'm managing it properly under the easement authority you helped me discover. Remember when you were measuring distances and researching utility requirements? You led me right to these documents," the contractor called out from the electrical panel. "Miss Chen, we're ready to switch over to the new management system. Mr. Morrison's service will be routed through your master panel starting today. His power won't be interrupted, but all electrical coordination for both properties will now go through your account." Jim's face went from red to pale. "Sarah, you can't do this. I have rights. You have the right to electrical service, Jim, and you'll continue receiving it. But you also spent the last month threatening to cut off my power over a legal car charger installation. You formed a fake HOA, harassed me with fraudulent fines, and documented my daily activities like I was a criminal." Sarah pulled out her phone and showed him photos she'd taken of his unauthorized modifications around the electrical meter. "Plus, you've been making modifications to my easement for years without permission. The decorative fence, the landscaping, that security light you installed last year, all of it was technically illegal under the easement agreement." The contractor finished the installation and handed Sarah a clipboard to sign. "All set, Miss Chen. Both properties are now running through your master electrical management system. You'll receive a single consolidated bill, and you have full control over electrical access for the easement area." Jim stood there speechless as the work crew packed up their equipment. His electrical service was now entirely dependent on Sarah's goodwill, the same goodwill he'd spent weeks systematically destroying. "Welcome to the consequences of your actions, Jim." But Sarah wasn't done yet. She had one more surprise that would expose just how deep Jim's hypocrisy really went. And when the neighborhood learned the truth about their fake HOA and Jim's secret electrical activities, the fallout would be spectacular. The aftermath was swift and devastating for Jim's little power trip. Within 48 hours of Sarah's electrical takeover, the entire neighborhood learned what had really been happening on Maple Street. Jim's first mistake was panicking. Instead of quietly accepting the new arrangement, he called the police, the city code enforcement office, and anyone else he could think of to complain about Sarah's illegal seizure of his electrical service. Every official who reviewed the situation came to the same conclusion. Sarah's actions were completely legal, and Jim had no grounds for complaint. His second mistake was continuing the HOA harassment campaign, even after losing control of his electrical service. Karen Walsh showed up at Sarah's door with another fake fine, this time for unauthorized utility modifications, apparently unaware that Sarah now controlled the very electrical system Karen was complaining about. "Karen, I need to show you something," Sarah said, leading her to the new electrical management panel. "See this master cutoff switch? I now have legal control over electrical service for both my house and Jim's house. So when you fine me for unauthorized electrical modifications, you're actually fining the person who controls your friend's power supply." Karen's confident expression melted into confusion. "That can't be legal. Here's my lawyer's business card." Feel free to call her, but I should mention that every document you've sent me claiming to represent a legitimate HOA is actually mail fraud. Monica's been building quite a case file. Karen left without another word, but the damage was already done. Jim had been bragging to other neighbors about his HOA victory over Sarah's car charger, and word had spread quickly through the community about the fake association and fraudulent fines. Mrs. Patterson from 3 houses down knocked on Sarah's door that evening. "Honey, I need to ask you something. Did Jim Morrison ever send you fake HOA letters?" It turned out Jim and Karen had been running their HOA scam on multiple neighbors for years. Mrs. Patterson had paid over $2,000 in fake fines for having the wrong mailbox color. The Johnsons had been harassed for months over their garden gnome collection. Even elderly Mr. Chen, no relation to Sarah, had received violation notices for parking his classic Buick in his own driveway. Sarah organized a neighborhood meeting in her backyard, inviting everyone Jim had targeted with fake HOA enforcement. 15 families showed up, each with their own folder of fraudulent documents and illegal fine notices. The total amount of money Jim and Karen had extracted through their fake association exceeded $12,000. "I think it's time we involved the actual authorities," Sarah announced. "This isn't neighbor drama anymore. This is organized fraud." Monica helped the neighbors file a group complaint with the district attorney's office. Mail fraud, impersonation of official authority, and extortion were serious charges that carried real consequences. Jim made one final desperate play. He tried to cut Sarah's electrical service by physically tampering with the connection lines, apparently hoping to disable her master control panel. Unfortunately for Jim, tampering with electrical infrastructure is a felony, and Sarah's security cameras captured the entire incident in high-definition video. The police arrested Jim at his front door the next morning. Karen and Rick Walsh were arrested later that day at their respective workplaces. The charges included mail fraud, utility tampering, criminal mischief, and operating an illegal fee collection scheme. The local news picked up the story. Fake HOA scam uncovered after neighbor war goes too far. Jim's mugshot appeared on 3 different channels, identified as the ringleader of a years-long neighborhood extortion operation. Sarah's car charger, the innocent device that had started this entire conflict, continued working perfectly in her driveway. She'd even added a small sign next to it, "Charging station approved by the actual property owner." The real kicker: Sarah discovered that Jim's electrical bill, which she now managed through her consolidated account, was 30% higher than her own usage despite his house being smaller. Jim had been illegally running a cryptocurrency mining operation in his garage, drawing massive amounts of power while complaining about Sarah's efficient car charger affecting the neighborhood grid. The hypocrisy was so perfect it almost seemed scripted. But the best part was yet to come. 6 months later, Sarah's neighborhood had transformed into the peaceful community she'd originally hoped for. Jim's house sold at a significant loss. Turns out having a criminal record for utility fraud makes it hard to find buyers. Karen and Rick Walsh moved across town after their court-ordered restitution payments to the scammed neighbors. The cryptocurrency mining equipment Jim had hidden in his garage. That became evidence in federal tax evasion charges when investigators discovered he'd been running an unreported business while collecting disability benefits. Sarah kept Jim's electrical service connected throughout the legal proceedings because, unlike him, she believed in basic human decency. But she did enjoy the monthly reminder that his former electrical expertise now depended entirely on her generosity. The neighborhood kids started calling Sarah's car charger the Justice Station every time they saw her plugging in her vehicle. They remembered the story of how one neighbor's greed and bullying backfired spectacularly. Mrs. Patterson used her restitution money to install solar panels and her own electric vehicle charger. The Johnsons added even more garden gnomes to their collection, including one that looked suspiciously like Jim Morrison behind bars. Mr. Chen painted his classic Buick bright purple just because he could. Sarah learned that standing up to bullies doesn't just protect yourself, it protects everyone around you. Jim and Karen's fake HOA had been terrorizing the neighborhood for years, but nobody wanted to be the first to fight back. Sometimes it takes one person willing to do the research and stand their ground to expose the truth. The most satisfying part wasn't the legal victory or the news coverage. It was the quiet evening when Sarah plugged in her electric car, looked across at the new neighbors who'd moved into Jim's old house, and realized she'd finally found the peaceful community she'd been looking for all along. The new neighbors? A lovely retired couple who complimented Sarah's car charger and asked for recommendations on installing their own. Have you ever dealt with a power-hungry neighbor or fake HOA trying to control your property? Share your story in the comments. Sometimes the best revenge is simply knowing your rights. Next week, we'll explore what happens when a Karen tries to steal someone's parking spot, not realizing they're messing with the property manager's spouse. Remember, bullies count on their victims being too intimidated or too busy to fight back. But knowledge is power, and sometimes the quiet person reading all the paperwork is exactly the wrong person to mess with.